Hello everyone, Jonathan Elton here. Today I'm going to talk about Al-Lajlaj's analysis in the Double Mujannah. This is some analysis that Al-Lajlaj did with the help of Asuli, probably around 850 or 860 AD. The reason I want to focus on it is that of all of the analysis that Al-Lajlaj did, I think his analysis on the Mujana is what is still the most relevant today. I think probably, there aren't so many games now being played with a double Mujana, but it still comes up from time to time. I've had games certainly against Chestakhanov, I've had games against Requadra, where I've played a Mujana with white, either on purpose or by accident, by transposition, and the other side has elected to play a double Mujana. And I think that what you'll find is that Al-Lajlaj's ideas are actually fairly original and fairly fresh. They're not necessarily ideas that we would play today, but I think there's a lot of room for exploration and potentially using some of this old analysis to come up with new ways to play this structure. So, as you're probably aware, in most modern games, the way that you would likely reach a double Mujana would be something along the lines of both sides playing a four pawns opening. And then after this is reached, rather than what we might consider the main line today, which would be e4, perhaps white plays pawn to c4. This is something that is certainly very common today. In this kind of structure, often you'll see knight c3 and then maybe e4 as well, with the furs coming up to e3. But then in a modern game, you might see something along the lines of black simply copying with c5, both sides developing out, and then here white might choose to play f4 and then f5, and we're going to most likely be headed for some sort of double Mujana. Of course, back in Al-Lajlaj's day, it was much more common for white to start with something like pawn to c3, and remarkably for black to actually copy this. Both sides might bring their pieces out. And here, rather than returning to play in the center, as we would most likely see today, it was not uncommon at all for white to play b3. Black might copy this with b6. White might play rook to b1, and we might actually see this entire scheme of development take place on the Shah side first. There's, of course, nothing wrong with this, and I think that the way that most players play today is a result simply of us taking modern chess principles that we have absorbed. Play in the center, and then of course an attack on the wing is best met by an attack in the center. And I think that these strategies do carry over. I'm certainly not an old school Shatranj purist where I think old ideas are the best and we can't really learn anything from modern chess. I think as Shatranj players, we have to take modern chess principles very seriously, and I think that that is the way that the game progresses. So, for instance, if I were playing black and someone were to play the very, very old school idea of c3, I played c6, maybe I probably wouldn't play c6, but let's say that white played c4, I would immediately be thinking in terms of how do I achieve the d5 break. I'm not going to copy to create a symmetrical structure, knowing that white is going to be a move ahead, getting in this pawn break. Instead, I'm going to play something like d6. If white comes out with knight to c3, I'll play e6. If white were to perhaps rather foolishly continue on the king side with something like pawn to b3, undoubtedly black is going to have a break here. Black's already starting to threaten things like exchanging, bringing the elephant to a6, targeting the weakened c4 pawn. Maybe white has to play d3. And here, of course, if I'm playing the black pieces, I really have to think and seriously consider a move like d4. Obviously, this is going to be a weakness and somewhat overextended, but white is going to have to figure out what to do with this knight. If it goes to the side, maybe black can even play b6, try to create the wedge in the center with a huge pawn chain. I don't know off the top of my head if this is necessarily best for black, because I think white is going to get a lot of counterplay against this pawn. You have this move, you have e3 as a potential break, but it's certainly the kind of thing that we would take very seriously today, and we would be looking for ways as black to strike in the center right away without delay and take advantage of the fact that white is playing this very, very slow kingside plan. But I will say that back in the 800s and 900s, players would have simply played c5 without even thinking about it, and we would have seen this kind of play emerge. And Al-Lajlaj actually has, from this position, an entire section of theory about, well, what happens if white immediately tries to play on the king side and does not bother to set up the rest of the Mujana structure with bringing the pawn to f4, pawn to e3, knight to f3. And of course, that analysis is interesting, but it wouldn't be considered very relevant today. So I'll go ahead, for our purposes here, I'll play out the modern move order. So here, not e4, but rather I'll play pawn to c4. I'll promote this variation. So pawn to c4, black might choose pawn to c5, knight to c3, knight c6, something like pawn to f4. Even here, black certainly isn't required to play pawn to f5 by any stretch of the imagination. In fact, modern play would almost undoubtedly see, if it's a very strong player handling the black pieces, black thinking through ways of maybe trying to take advantage of a premature pawn to f4. Maybe something like g6 is the best move, followed by maybe even pawn to h6 and achieving a g5 break. Maybe the best way to handle this is to bring the knight to e7 and try for an e5 break. So a lot of different ideas. In fact, probably f4 wouldn't be seen today. Probably in a game between the strongest players, white is going to play something like b3 if he wants to go into a Mujana here. Black might have nothing better to do than this. White would play here. Again, just keeping the options flexible. g6, and maybe now, well, probably rook b1 first would be the modern move. Black might copy rook b8. And so we would head into the double Mujana structure this way, with both players having gotten this far. Okay, so this is more or less the starting point for Al-Lajlaj's analysis. We do see some lines that he looks at where white forgoes playing rook to g1 right away and instead tries for something else. So for instance, a3. But this is certainly the main line in Al-Lajlaj's analysis. And this double Mujana structure was uh, almost essentially considered, one of the main lines of all of Shatranj at the time. Um, Again, not super common today, but I've certainly played maybe a dozen games in this structure. Some against very strong players. Requadra, for instance, has beaten me with the black pieces here. So if we reach this structure, we have to think about what is White's plan. Al-Lajlaj lays down three basic plans for White. He says that the first and best is to play something along the lines of A3 and B4. The second best, and what he indicates was the most popular among club players in the 800s, was to aim for the E4 break. Something like pawn to E4, followed by bringing the furzan up to E3 and hoping for play in the center. And then thirdly, Al-Lajlaj says White can play H3 and G4. And he says that that is the absolute worst possible plan of the three for White. He doesn't provide a ton of explanation on that, but the reason for this is even very well known today. The problem for White is that if he tries to advance on the furzan side rather than on the Shah side, Black can largely simply ignore it. So, for instance, if you play something like pawn to h3, let's say that Black continues to bring the rook lift over to try to advance on the Shah side. White were to play something like pawn to g4. Black could swing the rook either to c7 or to b7. Let's say c7 just for argument's sake. And in this position, after something like takes, rook to b2, hoping to get the rook doubled here and to penetrate to g7, Black could simply play furzan to f7. And now after this, Black has completely blocked this side of the board. And there is no good way for White to make progress. Obviously, White would like to be able to, for instance, create some sort of elephant sacrifice, maybe even on f5, something like here, followed by the bishop out. But there's just no way to get the bishop attacking this pawn and the knight attacking the pawn. Also, this whole structure is just completely rock solid. White will never achieve this break. It's too well guarded. And White's attack has just completely run out of steam. Probably the best that White could ever hope for on the furzan side is maybe to try to establish his furs, spending an exorbitant amount of time to get the furs up, but again, really to no avail. In the meantime, Black will simply proceed with a6 and b5 and have fantastic play on this side. So there's really no point in White going overboard trying to expand on this side. Even if we got to this position, White might be tempted to play g5. Black will be fine here, either after knight to d7, which is maybe the most principled move, just staying on the Shah side and getting ready for an attack, or even knight to h5 is probably playable, hoping to take advantage of the weakness of the f4 pawn. Black at some point might be able to get an elephant targeting it and have a chance to sacrifice the elephant for two pawns on f4. So knight h5 certainly playable, but just knight to d7 would be easy if White tries to create some sort of a break on this side. The furzan can sit comfortably here and guard it. Let's say that White tries to swing a rook over. Black proceeds on this side of the board. White breaks. Even if white manages to break through to this side, and even if he could get a rook into h7, which is perhaps a long shot given that after white takes, black can retake with the furzan if he chooses to guard this whole line. But even if takes, black took this way, white gets a rook to h7, black can actually just sit with king to e8. And there is no way for white to break through this structure. So it's dispiriting for white if he just sees the opportunity to gain space and seizes it with g5, and the attack with g takes f5 also just runs out of steam. So that's why this plan on the furzan side would go nowhere. The plan in the center with something like pawn to e4, this is a little bit beyond the scope, I think, of this lecture, and I think it's an interesting plan. I don't think it's one that would be very popular today, but it's something that would be worth looking at in another lecture. The long story short is that most of the time when white plays pawn to e4, black will have the opportunity to play f takes, d takes. In this remaining structure, black is doing very well because he has the center pawns. And as we know, that is more important in Shatranj than it is in regular chess. So black will have the opportunity to gain the center pawns. He will always have to move bishop h6 to threaten some sort of elephant sacrifice to create a weak pawn on f4, and he can bring the knight to h5. And perhaps most importantly, black will be able to play knight to d4, establishing this very good knight in the center. White will almost never be able to successfully exchange this off because the resulting position here, threatening knight to c3 check, in the event that white were to retake, this is just absolutely devastating for white. So black, in almost all of the lines that Al-Lajlaj looks at where white plays pawn to e4, black simply takes here, and something like this will give very good counterplay. I know I'm oversimplifying things a little bit, and there's really a lot more to it, but I think I would wait until another lecture to get into the weeds. Suffice to say, for now, I don't think anyone plays that way today. But what is still relevant today? Well, what is still very relevant today is something along the lines of a3, a6, and then probably not pawn to b4 right away, although there's certainly nothing wrong with that. But what Al-Lajlaj recommends and what is typically played today, even still, is rook to g2. So I'm going to go ahead and promote this variation. So this would be the main line, and the idea here is going with what Al-Lajlaj says is the best plan, a Shah side attack with the pawn coming up to b4. You'll notice that this is combining really the best of all worlds for white. It keeps the pawns on d3 and e3, so there's no opportunity for black to gain center pawns and come into d4. And it is playing on the side where the opponent is weakest. In other words, black would certainly never be able to just run the king up to b6 to gum up the works in quite the same way that if white plays on the furzan side, the furzan for black can simply sit on the g6 square and block the attacks. So rook to g2, certainly very common in play today. Black likely would respond rook g7. It's worth noting, of course, and Al-Lajlaj actually points this out as well. If black were to play pawn to h6 and white just ran a pawn, or white just ran his rook over to b2 and started to create counterplay here this way, the problem for black is, again, this white furs is just going to run to g3, and there's no way for black to break through on this side either. So black shouldn't waste time on h6. He should instead try to meet fire with fire and prepare for white's coming onslaught. So move 15, rook on g to b7. This is probably the main line. It's worth noting that there is a whole body of analysis on bringing the rook to c7 instead. And I think that will be a topic for another day. I think that probably rook to b7 is critical. Certainly in the games that I've played, this has been the modern interpretation for black, trying to simply hold this firm position on the Shah side. So here white plays pawn to b4. I think it's also worth noting that instead of rook on g to b7, black actually can, if he so chooses, stop white from playing pawn to b4. So one move that Al-Lajlaj gives is pawn to a5. I don't think that very many people would want to play this way today. The main reason is simply that this hole on b5 is going to be a strategic weakness for a very long time to come. At a juncture like this, white would actually be able to switch plans and start playing for pawn to e4 in the center. And white is not going to have nearly so much to fear from black meeting e4. So again, I don't know that e4 immediately is necessarily the best move to play, but essentially the idea for white would be strategically long term, when black gets his knight into d4, white will hope to, again, not right now because the e4 pawn falls, but long term, white would hope to lodge this knight into the b5 square and attack the pawn on d4. So certainly there's some value in white taking time to prepare this break. I wouldn't be very likely to play e4 right away. I would probably prepare it with something like queen to f2, and even potentially follow it with something like rook to e2 or rook to d2, and aim a little bit more slowly to get the pawn break in to e4. But long term, black does not have a good way to dislodge the white knight from b5. If he does, it's something rather ugly, like knight to a7. So it's, generally speaking, white's going to have a pretty nice strategic advantage there. So this plan with pawn to a5, much more popular in the 800s. In fact, it was so popular that Al-Lajlaj even considers what happens if white is the one to choose to play it before doubling rooks on the b file. Not something that you would ever see from white today, certainly. And even today, I don't think many players would want to play it with black. So what do we have? Well, in the main line, okay, white plays pawn to b4. Now, what happens next? in Al-Lajlaj's analysis is something that I find very surprising and I actually find extremely interesting. So I'm hopeful that players will draw some inspiration from this in our modern games. Black plays c takes b4, white plays a takes b4, black meets fire with b5, and here white plays an incredibly deep move, pawn to c5. Uh, I'm not sure that I can give this an exclamation point, but I will certainly give it the interesting move sign. And I think it's a tremendously practical way to play for the advantage with white. So I think we have to stop back up for a minute. After pawn to b4, many modern players would not play pawn takes b4 with black. Al-Lajlaj seems to take it as a given that in this position, black will exchange and play pawn to b5. He does not mess around with alternatives for black. I find that surprising because in modern games, I think black is actually very likely to play something rather innocuous here. Maybe bring the furzan to f7, bring it to d7, even king to c7 is probably the main move. Black would play his king out here. The idea being, okay, if white is to just exchange, this is undoubtedly just going to lead to a draw. That is going to create a very boring structure. So king to c7, guarding all of this. In modern play, this would be absolutely critical because white maybe doesn't want to play pawn to b5. If white plays pawn to b5, black is going to play knight to a5, trying to create counterplay here. White might exchange. The elephant comes out and attacks this pawn. White gets this very, very nice knight on the b5 square. But black might just be able to ignore it, either with king to d7 or even king to c6. And white suddenly finds that he has to babysit the pawn on c4. He might be able to do that with knight to d2, but here again, there's different approaches for black. Black might be able to strike in the center with d5. He might be able to strike in the center with e5. And simply a developing move with a furzan also wouldn't be a bad idea. And it's not entirely clear in the meantime how white is ever actually going to make any progress on this side of the board. Unlike the positions we've looked at previously, where black created a weakness on the b5 square by playing a5, here the position is so open on this side of the board that white doesn't seem to have a very good opportunity to make either of these pawn breaks, particularly given how weak his c4 pawn is. So king to c7, I think we would see in a lot more of our modern games. Reading Al-Lajlaj's text and looking at different games and lines that he presents, my best guess as to what he thought would be critical here is actually the rather bizarre retreat knight to a2. This was a thematic idea in the games of Al-Lajlaj and Asuli, as far as we know from the texts. And the idea is to support the b4 pawn, clear the way for this furzan to come up to c3, supporting it further, and then at the right moment, white can strike with a4 and a5, trying to break up this side of the board. I think getting into a deep analysis of that is a little bit beyond what I want to accomplish today. suffice to say that black has any number of responses that I'm sure if you put in the time to do a good analysis of them would lead at least to full equality. This might be the moment, for instance, to play this exchange and to come up with b5 when black suddenly has really good pressure on b4. Um, uh, this might also, after knight day2, and I think more than likely, this is going to be a time when black can simply develop. He can try to get a break in the center himself, particularly if white starts to get too carried away and plays a4 prematurely. Um, there's certainly some concrete lines to be looked at, but my sense is that black would be absolutely fine there. And I don't think that knight a2, which was certainly the old plan in these kinds of structures, would necessarily be the way to go. So a more modern interpretation for white would likely be to try to turn the attention back to creating an e4 break, maybe something like this. I think it's also possible that you would see white even running the king to the furzan side just to slowly try to create a squeeze out on this side where white plays for space with h3 and g4 in the long term. Um, Certainly black doesn't have a lot of activity now as things stand. Black is very passive, simply waiting for white to make a mistake on this side of the board. So I think rather than knight a2, which is kind of the old thematic idea, white would probably be aiming for some kind of very slow space gaining maneuver and biding his time because black is very cooped up on this side. The rooks can't swing back over to the furzan side easily, so breaks in the center and then breaks on the furzan side, and just looking after white's king safety, probably the route to go. But in any event, the old main line in the 800s and 900s was this. And here, if I'm looking at this for white with my very modern chess eyes, I'm just immediately thinking, okay, well, white should probably exchange, try to create a weakness on b5. After all, white's up a tempo. So the way that I analyzed this position at first was exchange, go ahead and break in the center so that we can get the furzan up, e4. Black might be struggling a little bit for some counterplays, so bring a rook to the a file. White can sort of shore up the position here with king to d2. Certainly nothing wrong with bringing the king to d2 because the bishop, of course, can jump over the king. So here, maybe king to d7. Something like this. And when I look at this, I'm really just thinking of ways to play this structure that are going to create just a tiny advantage for white. In fact, going back, putting the king on d2 isn't necessarily always going to be right here, because if black were to achieve this break, the bishop might come out and attack on b4, and this would be with check. That's certainly something that happened in some of the ancient analysis and ancient lines. So maybe just furzan here, furzan to d7. Maybe white's going to run the king all the way to this side. Just looking at some notes that I took a while back on this structure. looking at this as a possibility. Both sides continuing to play symmetrically. White might be able to try to pester this knight, play rook c2 here. This is something that I had analyzed as part of some of my opening preparation, getting the king all the way to safety on this side of the board. And king to f7, e takes. At some point, white has to create some sort of weakness or something to play against. So exchanging here, playing knight to h4, trying to attack this pawn. We'll have the bishop coming out to try to attack it. Black can certainly hunker down. This knight's a little bit loose, and it functions well on e7 to try to guard. Maybe here, bishop to h3. White might have a little bit of pressure in a scenario like this against these two pawns, but overall I would think that black, by and large, is doing fine. I wouldn't be displeased to get this position with the black pieces. Certainly, there's no reason to think that black's in any kind of trouble. The pressure might just be slightly annoying throughout the middle game, but certainly if pieces are traded and an endgame is reached, unless white is able to get his rook to c7 and get on the 7th rank, doesn't seem like white is going to have huge winning chances. So that's a line that I had analyzed a while back. It's part of some of my preparation. C takes b5, very modern way to play. Pawn to c5, very interesting. When we think about why would black, why would white play a move like c5, something that seemingly invites chaos in terms of this pawn is going to be weak after the exchange. Black is going to have two passed pawns coming down on the Shah side. It doesn't strike anybody immediately that white is going to have fantastic pressure on the c file. Although, as we'll see in some of the lines, white actually gets a lot more play on the c file than you would think. But you are left scratching your head at first as to why would anyone play this way. And I think the answer is that the theory of Shatranj that was developed by Asuli primarily, and particularly then taken even to kind of its logical extremes by Al-Lajlaj, is what I would call the theory of the two furzans. In Al-Lajlaj's play, the furzan is just like we say pawns are the soul of chess, to Al-Lajlaj and Asuli, the furzan is the soul of Shatranj. They are opposite colors from one another, meaning they can never take each other. And if you are able to create a good outpost for your furzan, then the assumption at that time was the rest is a matter of technique. Now, today, I think we would say it's a little bit of an exaggeration because we're able to hold a lot of endgames that would have been more daunting to hold at the time. But certainly every Shatranj player worth his salt knows that it is worth a tremendous amount of time and other kinds of investment, sacrificing random pawns, particularly weaker ones, rook pawns, and so forth, it's worth a lot of that. Even sometimes sacrificing the exchange is worth it in order to get a great outpost for your furzan on e5 or c5, but particularly e5, where it's likely to menace the opponent's king in some way. And so the plan that Al-Lajlaj has with the move c5 is to exchange this pawn, bring his knight back to e2, and clear the way for this furzan to come all the way up to c3 and eventually into the e5 square. So it's brilliant. The move c5 is brilliant in that strategic sense. I think you have to be a pretty far-ranging thinker to see that this plan is valuable in comparison to the counterplay that black will undoubtedly get on the Shah side, having these two-pass pawns, or in the event that white takes this way, black is getting tremendous counterplay against the b4 pawn by getting his elephant to d6. So, I think that it's really incredible that this move, in a way, it strikes me as incredible that it's even playable. So, I'll just touch on a couple of alternatives for black briefly. These are not ones that Al-Lajlaj thought were worthy of mention. But d5 would be kind of an obvious move. Well, it's an obvious candidate move. Really, it is not a good idea to push past. The weakness on e5 is going to be too much, and the pass pawn is very strong. White can just play something like knight to e2. So black might play king d7. Something, black might play something like this to try to create a break in the center. The thought is play the pawn to e5, get the bishop out to h6, attack the f4 pawn, but really it's going to be too slow. I'm sure that bringing the furzan to c3 is perfectly acceptable, but one idea that I found here that I really like is actually just to play here, threatening this fork, and black, if black takes, suddenly he has to deal with this threat. He has to play rook to c7. And now white has all the time in the world here to prevent the e5 break simply by going back to f3. Black might play here, still hoping to get the e5 break in. But this furzan comes out, black hits with the e5 break. It looks almost like black is doing okay strategically, because if white were to take, then black's knight is coming into play. White would certainly have some kind of strategic advantage after knight to d4, but it seems like black is holding the absolute kind of way to demolish this whole structure, though, is to realize black's rooks are tied up. The black king is vulnerable. White can just play h3 here, aiming to blow open the furzan side. Black might develop here, trying to get counterplay on the f4 pawn, but white simply doesn't care. Play here, threatening the fork. We just see some exchanges. White's threatening to play pawn to g5, so black's running out of time. If this, then white will probably just advance here. So black would sacrifice the elephant. But in something like this, after rook to e2, white just has a huge advantage here because of the lack of safety surrounding black's king. White, so after the furzan moves, or maybe we see something like bishop d6. White is simply going to run his furzan up here with check and then throw it into d6. Black is very, very close to lost here, given that his pieces are totally inactive and his king is open. So, um, looking at this, uh, pushing past with d5 is not going to be a good way for black to meet this break. Um, and likewise, I don't think that particularly passive play helps black either. So if black just say tries to run his king over to a safer area, play something like king to e7, um, white will just follow the plan of activating the furzan as we've described. Um, so something like this, knight to e2. Black might finish putting his king to safety. But white is going to have a nice opportunity to get an advantage on this side. There's some funny business now with the knight coming in, so black probably plays rook to c7. White can hold the c5 square with bishop to a3. It's certainly his advantage to do. Black is really struggling for counterplay. a5 is really the only option. So rook to a8, but now white can get his king to safety. So king to e2. Black is going to try to activate his furzan, get it to the d5 square. But I think that white has a pretty nice pull in this position. Really, any move here is fine for white. I've thought probably rook to a1 is a good choice with the idea that white's going to play c takes and then bishop to c5, and this pin is going to be annoying for black. White will threaten knight takes b5 at some points. And here we actually see the problem for black is he wants to go activate his furzan, bring it to the d5 square. But it actually creates problems where after something like rook to c1, the furzan is going to be pinned. So black really does have a lot of headaches. So I think these sample lines here just demonstrate black does really need to take the threat of c5 serious, or the threats behind c5 seriously, and he has to react with some kind of vigor. So the move that Al-Lajlaj thinks is really the main line for black and the best try is the move e5. So I'm going to go ahead and promote this variation. So, well, why e5? Well, we've seen what happens if black reacts with passivity. I think another very important move to consider here is going to be this exchange. This is certainly something that's analyzed in depth in some of Al-Lajlaj's other lines that he's looked at. In this particular position, I think one reason he doesn't like it is because we have the two rooks where there's really going to be sort of a bad pin on this b5 pawn. So for instance, if black pushes past with b4, this doesn't even do anything because black isn't even threatening to take on c3. But again, if black is to exchange this way, the point of white's play is likely going to be something like bringing this furzan in, playing knight to e2, knight to d4 to clear the way, and hopefully for him running the furzan in to e5, where together with the c5 pawn, it's going to be very powerful. So I'm not going to get further into d takes c5 today. It might be something to look at a little bit later in another lecture. But I think that Al-Lajlaj's move e5 really is the critical line for black. It's the most testing because suddenly black is going to be able to develop his bishop. He is threatening to create counterplay by taking here, maybe sticking a bishop on h6, and a knight on h5. I'm playing against the f4 pawn, which is a very common theme. And white has to really show what it is that he thinks is going to give him the advantage. So Al-Lajlaj's move is c takes d6 here. Strictly speaking, it's probably not necessary. And in fact, if I were playing this with white, I would probably prefer simply bringing the furs to d2. The idea here is, if I wasn't worried about d takes c5 before, there's no reason that I should be worried about it now. I haven't checked to see, maybe there are some intermezzos, but even just here strategically, white is continuing on with the plan. And Al-Lajlaj does not analyze simply bringing the furzan to d2, but I think that if this is going to be a starting point of any analysis, something that might come up, in a world championship game, if one is played nowadays, this would be the place for the players to really start their analysis. Al-Lajlaj's plan, c takes d6, is based on a very deep tactical idea that he believes works. Now, as we'll show, unfortunately, the tactical motif that he thought worked does not work. So, but strategically, the idea is simply to clear the way for white's pieces to come in on the dark squares. So, c takes d6. Black throws in e takes f4, of course. This is going to cause black headaches. So e takes f4 is an important intermezzo. White recaptures towards the center, which is self-explanatory. Bishop takes d6. Black is threatening the b4 pawn. And here is the tactical idea that in the 800s AD, Al-Lajlaj thought worked, but today we know doesn't. So knight to e5 is his move. The idea is straightforward. Black is attacking this pawn, so white is going to remove one of those attackers. And obviously this is going to be curtains for black. So, of course, if black simply plays something like king to c7, he's going to run into some headaches. Probably a rook's going to come over this way, threaten his king. So knight takes b4 is the critical move. In terms of alternatives, Al-Lajlaj doesn't really go into this, and I think it's certainly playable. Black can probably just play rook to c7, and then after the exchange, white will play first to d2. White is a little bit better here. There's going to be a slight strategic advantage for white simply by playing knight to e2. The furzan is going to come to c3. White will have ideas of knight d4. I'll also have ideas of bringing the furzan in. So the position's going to be a little bit uncomfortable to play. So after knight to e5, knight takes b4 is the critical move. Okay, so knight takes b4. Al-Lajlaj gives this move, well, the equivalent in his text of an exclamation point. It probably is. I mean, it is the best move, and in fact, it's almost forced. Black has won a rather important pawn He now has two connected passers, so rook takes b4 is necessary. After bishop takes b4, now white goes and wins the exchange back. Black will play king to c7, white will play knight takes b8. And here is where Al-Lajlaj missed something very important in his analysis. So Al-Lajlaj believed that black had nothing better than to save his elephant on b4, go back with bishop d6. The thought now is white will play knight takes, a6 check. So if you notice, the knight is trapped. Knight takes a6 check, bishop takes a6, and here Al-Lajlaj doesn't specify whether knight takes or rook takes is better, but you can take your pick. Probably knight takes would be a little bit more accurate. The idea being, okay, if something like king to c6, maybe knight d4 check, and only then exchange rooks, getting the king a little bit further from the center. But essentially, after knight takes b5 check, here, the or rook takes b5, and then this exchange, white has emerged up a pawn. Now, of course, this doesn't mean that white is automatically winning. These kinds of endgames with no rooks on the board are notoriously hard to win, and particularly with opposite colored furzans, and the elephants both still on the board. All of these are pieces that can't take one another. So this is going to be a challenging endgame for white to win. But that being said, the big advantage that white has here, besides simply the extra pawn, is that he'll be able to focus on this f5 pawn, hopefully. He'll play bishop to h3, he'll play knight to d4. Hopefully he'll be able to corral it. And in the meantime, if black tries to repay those courtesies, well, in this position, white could even start with king to e2 so that the king will be able to shore up these pawns. So Al-Lajlaj concludes that after that long, very tactical exchange of ideas from both parties, white is going to emerge up a pawn. Well, what is the problem? The problem is right here on move 24. Al-Lajlaj's suggestion of bishop to d6 for black as being the best move is flawed. Black has a different move here that saves the day and leads to at least an equal, if not a better position. If you want to pause the video and find it for yourself, this would be an ideal moment. I'll give you just a moment to do that. Okay, all right. So looking at this position, you notice that white's knight is trapped. You also notice that the only thing he can do with it is to sacrifice it for this pawn with check. Black, in the meantime, has his elephant on b4 hanging. So logically then, the right move for black is to play pawn to a5. The knight remains trapped, and black is able to defend the elephant on b4. In terms of the material count, now it is black who is up a pawn rather than white. That's not to say that white is necessarily going to be worse. Actually, so for instance, in this position, white could quite skillfully switch tactics, play rook a1 here to target this a5 pawn. Now, of course, if black were to play rook takes, then white would play rook takes, and again, at least maybe have some play against this pawn. But king to b6, simply continuing this this line of play for black, is going to end up giving black an equal or better position, because the knight is still trapped and black is still able to maintain these pawns. So, uh, move 25. Looking at this, white's still got to find a way to get a pawn back. The best I could do for white is knight to c6. Black will play king takes c6, and now rook takes on a5. And here I don't really see any advantage at all for white. Probably just bishop to d6. The f4 pawn is weak. Black's going to play knight to d5 or knight to h5 and attack it. Black can even start pushing the b5 pawn down. So ultimately, this position, if I had to choose, probably I would take the black pieces here. Really, I think that white's practical chances of winning this endgame are very slim, and I think that all of the practical chances lie with black. So, unfortunately for Al-Lajlaj's very brilliant idea from a tactical perspective doesn't work out. In his work, he really does praise this exchange sacrifice, and says, essentially that he's discussed it with other people, and everybody agrees that this is a really brilliant way for white to play. Unfortunately, the concrete tactics don't quite work. So where does that leave us? Well, I think from an analytical standpoint, I think that means that the move c takes d6 here is not going to be white's best option. As I said earlier, I think maybe bringing the furzan to d2 is where my money would be. You might even see a move like king to e2. So that's likely the direction that any future games in this line would be headed. I think after c5, I think Al-Lajlaj got it right that e5 is black's highest and best chance here. I think all of the other moves are going to lead to some kind of advantage for white, and I think it's going to be very difficult to play. In terms of what I've said about this structure, again, I think a lot of modern players would simply opt for king to c7, essentially saying to white, prove that you have some kind of an advantage here. And I think it is interesting that Al-Lajlaj doesn't take this idea very seriously in his work. And it certainly, I think, shows the fighting spirit of players at that time, who were probably less likely in simply groveling their way to a draw, as nowadays we tend to think probably black should do, particularly if black is playing something like a double Mujana, rather than trying to mix things up from the get-go. So I think that is really where we are. Again, I think this line is one of the most fascinating in Al-Lajlaj's entire book. I do plan to do another lecture where I will cover some of the other strategies and some of the other ideas. I don't think that they're as sharp or as brilliant, and we will get to lines where Al-Lajlaj really misses the mark in his analysis, and where some of the suggestions given strategically are nothing that we would want to play today. But what we have seen today is certainly the most relevant. I want to thank everyone who helped with this video. In particular, I want to thank Thomas Neeson for his excellent work in empowering this computer program, Chess Suite, and fixing this up so that I would be able to keep track of the moves here. If you're interested in trying to get a PGN of any of the analysis here, please don't hesitate to reach out to me on chess.com. My username there is Jonathan Hilton. Thank you. Bye.